The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as a lone figure in a wheelchair made his way toward Riley's Diner, a local establishment that had been serving the best coffee in town for over 3 decades. The man's broad shoulders and well-maintained physique stood out even from his seated position. His eyes, sharp and alert, scanned his surroundings, a habit he'd never lost from his military days. The small bell above the diner's door chimed as he wheeled himself in, the aroma of fresh coffee and bacon filling the air. Most of the regular morning crowd was already there, elderly couples sharing breakfast, workers grabbing their morning coffee, and in the corner, a group of bikers whose leather vests displayed their gang insignia. The diner had always been a peaceful place where locals gathered to share stories and start their day. But this morning felt different. The usual warm chatter dimmed as the man in the wheelchair positioned himself near the counter. Mrs. Riley, who'd been running the place since her husband passed, gave him her signature warm smile as she approached with a menu. "Welcome to Riley's," she said, her voice carrying the friendly southern charm the diner was known for. "First time here?" The man nodded, his voice deep but gentle as he replied, "Yes, ma'am. Heard you serve the best coffee in 3 counties." His military bearing was evident in his polite response, though he tried to keep a low profile. From the corner, the bikers' conversation grew deliberately louder. Their leader, a tall man with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos, made no attempt to hide his disapproving glares. The tension in the air grew thicker as one of them loudly commented about keeping things the old way. The man in the wheelchair ignored the remarks, focusing instead on ordering his breakfast. He'd faced worse situations during his years of service. As a decorated Navy SEAL, he'd learned that true strength often meant choosing when not to engage. Mrs. Riley could sense the brewing tension. She'd seen similar situations before, but never quite like this. As she poured his coffee, her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from concern for what might unfold in her beloved diner. The breakfast crowd watched from the corners of their eyes, some pretending to be absorbed in their newspapers, others stirring their coffee far longer than necessary. The scene felt like a pot of water slowly coming to a boil. A young waitress, new to the job and unaware of the tension, cheerfully approached the man's table with a pot of coffee. "Refill, sir?" she asked, her smile genuine and untouched by the prejudice floating through the air. The man smiled back, holding up his cup. This simple interaction seemed to irritate the bikers even more. Their leader whispered something to his companions, causing them to snicker menacingly. The man in the wheelchair noticed everything. The positioning of the bikers, the exits, the other patrons, the kitchen door. His situational awareness had been honed through years of training and combat experience. He knew things could escalate, but he also knew he had nothing to prove. Outside, the morning traffic began to pick up as people headed to work. Through the diner's large windows, life went on as normal, creating a stark contrast to the brewing situation inside. A school bus passed by, filled with children's laughter, reminding everyone in the diner of the community they all shared, regardless of their differences. The man sipped his coffee slowly, appreciating its rich flavor. His wheelchair was positioned at a slight angle, giving him a clear view of both the entrance and the biker group. To others, it might have seemed casual, but it was a tactical position, another remnant of his military training. The other customers began to feel the weight of the moment. An elderly couple quietly asked for their check, not wanting to be present if things turned ugly. A businessman in a suit hurriedly finished his breakfast, leaving a larger tip than usual, as if apologizing for what might happen after he left. Mrs. Riley moved behind the counter with purpose, her eyes darting between the man in the wheelchair and the bikers. She'd seen her share of trouble over the years, but had always managed to keep the peace in her establishment. Today, she wasn't so sure. The morning sun continued to climb, sending streaks of light across the checkered floor of the diner. The man's coffee was half finished, steam still rising from the cup. His breakfast would arrive soon, but everyone in the diner knew that this morning was about more than just a simple meal. In this moment, the diner had become a stage where different worlds collided, a microcosm of larger societal tensions. The man in the wheelchair represented change and challenge to those who resisted it, while the bikers embodied an old guard refusing to adapt. No one in the diner could have guessed that this ordinary morning would become a turning point for their small community, or that the man quietly drinking his coffee was about to teach them all a powerful lesson about courage, dignity, and the true meaning of strength. The kitchen door swung open as Mrs. Riley emerged with the man's breakfast, the plate loaded with eggs, bacon, and hash browns. The simple act of serving breakfast seemed to pause time, creating a brief moment of normalcy in the increasingly tense atmosphere. Little did anyone know, this was just the beginning of a story that would be told in their small town for years to come. The morning crowd at Riley's diner had thinned out, leaving behind an unusual quiet that seemed to amplify every clink of coffee cups and scrape of forks against plates. The man in the wheelchair continued eating his breakfast, maintaining his composed demeanor despite the growing hostility from the corner where the bikers sat. One of the bikers, wearing a leather vest covered in patches, stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He made his way to the jukebox, deliberately taking a path that brought him unnecessarily close to the man's table. As he passed, he bumped roughly into the back of the wheelchair. "Oh, my bad," the biker said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "Didn't see you there." The comment drew snickers from his companions in the corner. The man in the wheelchair simply adjusted his position and continued eating. His calm response seemed to irritate the bikers even more. Their leader, watching from the corner, cracked his knuckles loudly, a sound that echoed through the nearly empty diner. Mrs. Riley emerged from behind the counter, coffee pot in hand, her face tight with concern. She'd seen trouble brew before, but something about today felt different. The air was thick with tension, like the moments before a summer storm. "Everything all right over here?" she asked, her voice steady despite her worry. She topped off the man's coffee cup, using the moment to stand protectively near his table. "Just fine, ma'am," the man replied quietly, offering her a reassuring smile. His voice carried a hint of authority that came from years of leadership, though he tried to keep it subtle. The bikers' conversations grew louder, filled with pointed comments about people knowing their place and the way things used to be. Each word was clearly meant to provoke a reaction, but the man remained focused on his meal, his military training evident in his disciplined response to their taunts. A young family that had just walked in quickly picked up on the atmosphere and decided to leave, the parents hurrying their children back out the door. The bell's cheerful chime seemed out of place in the tense environment. Another biker stood up, this one wearing a bandana and sporting a gray-streaked beard. He made his way to the counter, positioning himself just 2 seats away from the man's wheelchair. "Sure is interesting how some folks think they can just roll in anywhere these days," he said loudly, emphasizing the word roll with obvious meaning. The few remaining customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. An elderly man reading his newspaper lifted it higher, as if trying to create a barrier between himself and the growing conflict. The young waitress busied herself wiping already clean tables, her earlier cheerfulness replaced with nervous energy. Mrs. Riley moved behind the counter, keeping herself positioned where she could reach the phone if needed. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged coffee cups, but her face remained determined. This was her diner, and she'd seen it through tough times before. The man in the wheelchair took another sip of his coffee, his movements deliberate and controlled. His eyes, while appearing to focus on his breakfast, tracked every movement in the diner, a skill honed through years of special operations training. The biker gang's leader finally stood up, his massive frame casting a shadow across the diner floor. He walked with deliberate slowness toward the man's table, his boots making heavy sounds against the linoleum. The other bikers watched with anticipation, expecting their leader to put this newcomer in his place. What nobody in the diner realized was that this moment was about to become a turning point, not just for those present, but for the entire community. The man in the wheelchair had faced worse situations in combat zones across the world, and he knew that sometimes the greatest victories come from the most unexpected confrontations. The diner had gone completely silent now, save for the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Time seemed to slow down as the biker leader approached, his face set in a mask of intimidation that had worked countless times before. Mrs. Riley's hand moved closer to the phone, while the young waitress frozen in place, clutching her serving tray like a shield. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, creating long shadows that stretched across the diner floor, setting the stage for what was about to unfold. The man in the wheelchair could feel the leader's approach from behind, but he didn't turn around. Years of training had taught him to wait, to let situations develop, to maintain control through calm rather than confrontation. His hands remained steady as he set down his coffee cup, preparing for whatever might come next. What nobody in that diner could have predicted was how the next few moments would challenge their preconceptions and change their understanding of strength, courage, and respect. The stage was set for a lesson that would resonate far beyond the walls of Riley's dinner. The biker leader now stood directly behind the man's wheelchair, his shadow looming over the half-finished breakfast plate. The other customers in Riley's diner held their breath, creating a silence so complete you could hear the soft ticking of the wall clock counting each second. "Seems to me," the leader began, his voice carrying across the diner, "that some folks don't understand how things work around here." He placed a heavy hand on the back of the wheelchair, his fingers gripping the handle tight enough to make the metal creak. The man in the wheelchair slowly set down his coffee cup. His movements were calm and measured, but there was something in his posture that spoke of hidden strength. Years of special operations training had taught him that true power often lies in restraint. "Sir," the man said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of command without raising its volume, "I'm just here to enjoy my breakfast." His words were simple, but they held a quiet dignity that made several of the diner's patrons sit up straighter in their seats. Mrs. Riley stepped forward from behind the counter, her face showing both concern and determination. "Now listen here," she started, but the biker leader cut her off with a dismissive wave. "This ain't your business, Mrs. Riley," he growled, his attention fixed on the man in the wheelchair. "This is between me and our guest." He emphasized the last word with clear distaste. What happened next caught everyone by surprise. The bell above the diner's door chimed as an older man walked in, wearing a worn veteran's cap. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes widening with recognition as he looked at the man in the wheelchair. "I don't believe it," the veteran said, his voice cutting through the tension. "It's really you, isn't it? From the Carrier Group in the Gulf?" His words carried a mix of respect and amazement that made the biker leader's hand loosen slightly on the wheelchair. The man in the wheelchair turned slightly, a flash of recognition crossing his face. "Third Fleet," he responded quietly, a subtle nod acknowledging their shared past. The veteran took a few steps closer, his face breaking into a broad smile. "Folks," he announced to the diner, his voice trembling with emotion, "do you have any idea who this is?" This man led one of the most decorated SEAL teams in recent history. I watched him bring our boys home from missions that... He paused, shaking his head. "Well, let's just say I've never seen anything like it." The atmosphere in the diner shifted perceptibly. The biker leader's hand fell away from the wheelchair as if it had suddenly become hot to the touch. His companions at the corner table straightened up, their earlier swagger replaced by uncertainty. "I was there when he got injured," the veteran continued, his voice growing thick with emotion. "Saving 2 young sailors from an ambush. Took 3 bullets himself, but still managed to get everyone to safety. They gave him the highest honors, but he never talked about it, just did what needed doing." The young waitress had stopped pretending to clean tables, her mouth slightly open as she listened. Mrs. Riley stood behind her counter, tears welling in her eyes. Even the elderly man with his newspaper had lowered it completely, forgotten in his lap. The man in the wheelchair remained silent, his eyes meeting the biker leader's gaze steadily. There was no challenge in his look, no anger or resentment, just a quiet strength that seemed to fill the entire diner. The biker leader shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. His face showed a complex mix of emotions: shame, respect, and something else: recognition. Recognition that he had badly misjudged the man before him. A police car cruised slowly past the diner's windows, its presence a reminder of the world outside these walls. But inside, time seemed suspended as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The man in the wheelchair picked up his coffee cup again, took a slow sip, and then spoke softly. "In my team," he said, his voice carrying easily in the silent diner, "we never cared about what a person looked like or where they came from. We only cared about one thing: could they do the job when everything was on the line?" His words hung in the air, simple but powerful. The biker leader's face reddened, not from anger this time, but from something that looked a lot like understanding. The other bikers at the corner table sat in uncomfortable silence, their earlier bravado completely forgotten. The morning sun had climbed higher now, its rays streaming through the diner's windows and illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. In that light, everyone could see each other clearly, not as stereotypes or threats, but as people. It was a moment of truth that would change everything that followed, though none of them knew it yet. The confrontation had reached its peak, but not in the way anyone had expected. Sometimes the most powerful moments come not from violence or force, but from understanding and respect. The revelation of the man's identity had transformed the atmosphere in Riley's diner completely. The veteran who'd recognized him pulled up a chair, his movements showing deep respect as he settled nearby. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, but now it felt warmer somehow, less harsh than before. "I never thought I'd see you again, sir," the veteran said, his voice carrying both awe and gratitude. "That night in the Gulf, well, a lot of us wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you." He turned to address the diner at large, his eyes bright with emotion. This man didn't just lead missions, he changed lives. The biker leader, who moments ago had been so intimidating, now stood awkwardly by the table. His massive frame seemed smaller somehow, humbled by the presence of true courage. His fingers fidgeted with the patches on his leather vest, one of which, people now noticed, was a military service pin. You served," the man in the wheelchair asked quietly, noticing the pin. His keen eyes had caught what others had missed. The biker leader's tough exterior cracked slightly. "2 tours in Afghanistan," he admitted, his voice rougher than before. "Infantry. Nothing like what you did, but—" He trailed off, struggling with emotions he hadn't expected to face over breakfast. Mrs. Riley moved closer, coffee pot in hand, but this time she wasn't intervening. She was bearing witness to something extraordinary. The young waitress stood nearby, her order pad forgotten in her hand, completely absorbed in the unfolding scene. "A soldier is a soldier," the man in the wheelchair said firmly. "We all served. We all sacrificed." His words carried no judgment, no condemnation for the earlier hostility. Instead, they offered understanding and a bridge across the divide that had seemed so wide just minutes before. The veteran nodded enthusiastically. "You should have seen him in action," he continued, addressing the biker leader now. "We had this mission, terrible storm, visibility near zero. Most would have called it off, but there were men who needed help." He paused, glancing at the man in the wheelchair for permission to continue. The man gave a slight nod, allowing the story to be told. He rarely spoke of his experiences, but sometimes stories needed to be shared to help others understand. "The waters were so rough they were throwing our boats around like toys," the veteran continued. "But he kept us focused, kept us moving. When we found the stranded team, they were barely hanging on. The extraction seemed impossible, but the veteran's voice cracked with emotion. He made impossible things happen." The other bikers had drawn closer now, their earlier aggression replaced by genuine interest. One of them, a younger man with a neatly trimmed beard, pulled up a chair backward and sat, listening intently. "The thing about combat," the man in the wheelchair said softly, "is that it teaches you what really matters. When bullets are flying, you don't care about the color of the hand reaching out to pull you to safety. You don't care about where someone came from or what they look like. You only care that they're there, fighting beside you." The biker leader swallowed hard, then pulled up a chair himself. His movement seemed to give permission to the others, and soon the small group had formed an impromptu circle around the table. Mrs. Riley quietly began refilling coffee cups, understanding that something important was happening in her diner. "I lost my best friend over there," the biker leader said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look anything like me. Didn't come from anywhere near where I grew up. But he was my brother in every way that mattered." His hands clenched on the table. "Sometimes I forget that. Sometimes I let anger about other things." He trailed off, unable to finish. The man in the wheelchair reached out and placed a hand on the biker's arm. The gesture was simple but powerful, a warrior acknowledging another warrior's pain. The morning light caught the tears in the biker leader's eyes, but nobody looked away. There was no shame in this emotion. The elderly couple who had been watching from their booth quietly asked the waitress for more coffee, not wanting to leave. Even the businessman who had been checking his watch every few minutes settled back in his seat, his morning meetings forgotten. Tell us more, one of the younger bikers asked quietly. About your team, about what it was really like. His voice carried genuine curiosity, free from the prejudice that had filled it earlier. The diner had become a place of healing, where barriers built by fear and misunderstanding began to crumble. The man in the wheelchair looked around at the faces turned toward him, faces that had shown hatred just minutes before, but now showed respect, curiosity, and a desire to understand. This was how change happened, not through force or confrontation, but through shared stories and recognized humanity. The morning that had started with tension was transforming into something none of them had expected. A moment of connection that would ripple out far beyond the walls of Riley's dinner. The morning had stretched into early afternoon at Riley's diner, but nobody seemed to notice the time passing. The man in the wheelchair had become the center of an attentive circle, his quiet words carrying weight earned through years of service and sacrifice. Our team was different from most, he explained, his voice soft but clear. We had guys from every background you could imagine. Farm boys, city kids, rich, poor, none of that mattered once we put on that uniform. He paused, taking a sip of his now cold coffee, which Mrs. Riley quickly refreshed. The biker leader, who had pulled his chair closer, nodded in understanding. Like my old unit, he said. We started out separated by our differences, but after a few months in the sandbox, he shook his head, remembering. Those differences just disappeared. Exactly, the man in the wheelchair responded. When you're out there, trust matters more than anything else. You learn to see past the surface to see the person underneath. His eyes swept around the group, including everyone in his gaze. That's something we could use more of back home. The young waitress, who had been listening intently while pretending to wipe nearby tables, finally gathered her courage. My brother's thinking about joining the military, she said, but our parents are worried. They've heard stories. The man in the wheelchair turned to her with a gentle smile. It's natural to worry, he said. But tell your brother something for me. The military isn't just about fighting. It's about finding strength you never knew you had and learning to see the best in people who might seem different from you. One of the younger bikers, who had been quietly absorbing everything, suddenly spoke up. Is that how you deal with it? He asked, gesturing vaguely at the wheelchair. With everything that happened to you? The diner grew quiet, the question hanging in the air. Even Mrs. Riley paused in her coffee rounds, sensing the importance of the moment. Every morning, the man began, his voice thoughtful, I have a choice. I can focus on what I've lost, or I can remember what I've gained. The wheelchair, he patted the arm of his chair, it's just metal and wheels. What matters is what's inside a person, their character, their heart. The biker leader's eyes grew misty. I came back with my own scars, he admitted, touching his chest where unseen wounds lay hidden. Some you can see, some you can't. Been angry for a long time, taking it out on the world. He looked down at his hands, as if seeing them for the first time. Maybe that's why he gestured to his gang, unable to finish the thought. Pain can make us build walls, the man in the wheelchair acknowledged. But it can also teach us to build bridges. Every person in this diner has their own battles, their own scars. The question is, what do we do with that pain? Do we use it to divide or to understand? The elderly couple who had stayed to listen nodded in agreement. The husband reached across their table to hold his wife's hand, their own shared battles reflected in the gesture. The morning rush hour had long passed outside the diner's windows, but inside, time seemed to stand still. The sunlight had shifted, casting new patterns across the checkered floor, highlighting the unlikely group gathered around the table. I've been thinking, the biker leader said slowly, about starting a veterans support group. Been putting it off, telling myself nobody would come. But maybe, he looked around at his fellow bikers, seeing nods of encouragement. That's exactly what this town needs, the veteran who had first recognized the man chimed in. A place where we can all come together, share our stories, help each other heal. Mrs. Riley, who had been quietly watching everything unfold, stepped forward. You could meet here, she offered. Tuesday nights are usually slow. I'll keep the coffee hot and the doors open. The transformation in the diner was complete. The same space that had crackled with tension earlier now hummed with possibility. The bikers who had entered as intimidators were now leaning forward in their chairs, engaged in planning something positive for their community. The young waitress had stopped pretending to clean and pulled up a chair of her own. My brother would love to hear these stories, she said. Maybe it would help him understand what he's signing up for. Bring him by, the man in the wheelchair said warmly. We'll make sure he knows what real strength looks like. He glanced meaningfully at the biker leader, who straightened with newfound purpose. Outside, the world continued its daily rhythm, unaware of the small miracle taking place inside Riley's diner. But for those present, something profound had shifted. They had witnessed the power of understanding to break down barriers and the strength that comes from sharing our common humanity. Word spread quickly through the small town about what had happened at Riley's diner that morning. By late afternoon, the story had made its way through local shops, school hallways, and front porches where neighbors gathered to talk. Each telling added another layer of wonder to the tale of how a quiet breakfast had turned into something extraordinary. The man in the wheelchair had moved to a booth near the window, where afternoon light streamed in. The biker leader sat across from him, his massive frame somehow looking more approachable now. They'd been talking for hours, sharing stories that bridged the gap between their different lives. You know, the biker leader said, running a hand through his beard thoughtfully, I've got guys in my crew who could really use someone to talk to. Veterans who came back different, struggling to fit in. He paused, considering his next words carefully. Would you be willing to meet with them? The man's eyes lit up with purpose. That's exactly why I'm here, he replied. I've been traveling to different towns, looking for places where I can make a difference. Wasn't planning to stay here long, but he gestured around the diner, which had become a hub of activity and conversation. More townspeople had begun dropping by, drawn by the stories they'd heard. A local high school teacher brought in some of his students who were interested in military service. They sat at nearby tables, listening intently as veterans shared their experiences. Mrs. Riley had to call her daughter to bring extra coffee supplies from home. The diner hadn't seen this kind of crowd in years, but it wasn't just about the business. Something more important was happening. Her diner was becoming a place of healing. The young waitress's brother had arrived after school, still in his football practice gear. He sat at the counter, completely absorbed in the conversations around him. His earlier uncertainty about military service had been replaced by a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to serve. We could do something regular, the biker leader suggested, warming to his idea. Not just for veterans, but for the whole community. A place where people can come together, learn from each other. His eyes, once hard with anger, now showed a glimmer of hope. One of the other bikers pulled out his phone, showing everyone a social media post that was already going viral in their small town. Someone had captured a photo of the unlikely group gathered at the diner, the man in the wheelchair, the bikers, veterans, and townspeople, all sharing coffee and conversation. Look at the comments, he said, scrolling through. People are talking about starting similar groups in other towns. They're saying if we can do it here. His voice trailed off, amazed at how far their story had already spread. The elderly couple who had stayed through the whole thing finally stood to leave, but not before the husband shared his own story. I served in Vietnam, he said quietly. Never talked about it much, not even to my wife. But seeing all this, he squeezed his wife's hand. Maybe it's time to start. Outside, the afternoon sun painted the street in warm colors. Through the diner's windows, people passing by could see the extraordinary gathering inside. Some stopped to take pictures, others came in to be part of it. The barrier between outsider and insider had dissolved. The biker leader's phone kept buzzing with messages from other chapters of his group. They're asking how we did it, he said, shaking his head in wonder. How we turned things around so completely. He looked at the man in the wheelchair with newfound respect. Truth is, we just needed someone to show us a better way. Mrs. Riley watched from behind her counter as plans were made, phone numbers exchanged, and promises to return were given. Her diner had always been a gathering place, but now it felt like something more. A sanctuary where people could come together and find common ground. Next Tuesday then, she confirmed, marking it in her calendar. First meeting of the Veterans Support Group. She looked around at the faces that had become familiar over the course of the day. And everyone's welcome. The man in the wheelchair smiled, seeing his mission taking shape in an unexpected way. What had started as a confrontation had transformed into an opportunity for real change. The town that had seemed so divided that morning was now showing signs of coming together. As the afternoon wore on, more stories were shared, more bridges built. The young waitress started a list of people interested in joining the support group. It already filled both sides of her order pad. The biker leader's crew, once intimidating figures, now helped arrange tables and chairs for better conversation. Through it all, the man in the wheelchair shared his quiet wisdom, helping everyone see past their differences to the humanity they shared. His presence had sparked something in this small town, a reminder that sometimes the strongest people are those who choose understanding over anger and unity over division. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning at Riley's Diner, and the small town had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The diner itself had become more than just a place to grab coffee and breakfast. It had transformed into the heart of a community finding its way back to unity. The Tuesday night veterans meetings had grown so large they'd had to expand into the community center next door. The biker leader, now clean-shaven and wearing a polo shirt alongside his leather vest, stood at the entrance greeting newcomers with a warm handshake. "Can't believe how far we've come," he said to Mrs. Riley as she brought over a fresh pot of coffee. The diner had become the unofficial gathering spot before and after meetings, with veterans and townspeople mingling freely, sharing stories and support. The young waitress, now in college studying social work, still worked part-time at the diner. Her brother had completed basic training and sent letters describing how the stories he'd heard that day had prepared him for military life better than any recruitment video. "He says he tells everyone about our town," she shared proudly, pinning another letter to the diner's new community board, about how a single morning changed everything. The wall behind the counter had become a gallery of transformation. Photos showed the biker group at various community events, helping at the local food bank, mentoring troubled youth, organizing fundraisers for disabled veterans. Their leather vests, once symbols of intimidation, now carried patches promoting unity and understanding. The elderly veteran who'd first recognized the man in the wheelchair had become a regular speaker at local schools. "Kids need to hear these stories," he'd say. "Not just about war, but about how we can overcome our differences and find common ground." The man in the wheelchair had indeed stayed in town, though he still traveled to other communities sharing his message. Each time he returned, he found the seeds of change he'd planted had grown stronger. The diner always kept his usual spot by the window ready, and people would gather to hear about the changes happening in other towns inspired by their story. "It's spreading," he told the group gathered around his table one morning. "Other communities are starting their own programs. They're learning what we learned, that our differences don't have to divide us." Mrs. Riley's daughter had started a social media account documenting the town's journey. The posts showed a community transformed, bikers and businessmen sharing coffee, veterans of different backgrounds helping each other heal, young and old working together on community projects. "Remember that first morning?" the biker leader asked, sitting across from the man in the wheelchair in what had become their regular morning ritual. "I was so full of anger, so wrong about everything." He shook his head at the memory. "We all have moments that define us," the man replied, his voice carrying the same quiet strength that had changed so many lives that first day. "It's what we do after those moments that matters." The town itself had become a model for others struggling with division. News outlets had picked up their story, and visitors often came to see how a small diner had become the catalyst for such profound change. But for the locals, it wasn't about the attention, it was about the genuine connections they built. The young people of the town had been particularly affected. The high school principal reported fewer incidents of bullying and discrimination. Students had started a diversity club inspired by the veterans' stories of unity in service. When they see tough bikers and decorated veterans talking about the importance of understanding and respect, she explained, it carries a different kind of weight. Even the town's annual festivals had transformed. What used to be sparsely attended events now brought the whole community together. The sight of leather-clad bikers helping elderly veterans navigate crowded streets had become commonplace. The man in the wheelchair watched it all with quiet satisfaction. His injury had led him to this place, this mission of bringing people together. What others might have seen as a limitation had become his strength, a reminder that appearances don't define what a person can contribute to their community. As the sun set on another day at Riley's Diner, the regulars gathered for coffee and conversation. The evening light filtered through the windows, catching the silver in the biker believer's beard and glinting off the wheels of the chair that had once seemed to divide, but now united. "You know what I've learned?" the biker leader said, looking around at the diverse group that had become like family. "Strength isn't about who can intimidate others. It's about who can bring people together, who can help others find their way." The man in the wheelchair smiled, seeing his own journey reflected in those words. What had started as a potential confrontation had grown into something beautiful. A reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating others, but from helping everyone rise together. As Mrs. Riley turned on the diner's lights for the evening crowd, the warm glow seemed to symbolize the light of understanding that had spread through their town. The story that had begun with tension and prejudice had transformed into one of hope, proving that change is possible when people choose to see the humanity in each other.